Hey folks, Steve here with a bit of an oddball video for you today. This video is really coming out of, it's essentially a response to some comments I was getting from a few folks on my Follow the Third Reich video series, questioning the game's design and having certain hexes set as swamp terrain on the map. And I'm showing a virtual version of the map just on Board Game Geek. Someone has a picture uploaded. The hexes of concern are is the hex south of Rome, which is representing sort of the Anzio terrain, as well as the 1, 2, 3 hexes, depending on how you want to look at those hex sides. 3 hexes in Sicily around Syracuse that are swamp. Both sets are swamp hexes, and a few folks, and in particular, I think one user is like very much of the opinion like those should not be swamp hexes. There are not swamps in those regions. This is really wrong, or it's very incorrect. And I couldn't help but think through that. Okay, well, I guess I don't know. I'm not super familiar with these areas. I've been to Rome, but I've not been to Syracuse, so I don't really know, what the terrain is. Some of these areas are, but I know that a lot of people think of Italy as a much drier, rough terrain type of area, right? And most war games are going to have that kind of terrain for these areas, right? That's in my mind that I too think that, right? So I wanted to research this a little bit more and try to understand why are the hexes this way? Is there anything to back up these hexes being labeled as swamp hexes? And I think, it turns out, I think there are reasons. Now, whether or not I agree with them or you agree with them, I don't know. But I have kind of found the reasons, I guess, why it might be acceptable to have them set this way. So we're gonna go through that. Before I do, I want to make a call out here. Apparently, I've got this feature on YouTube. There's a community tab for my channel, and I've used it twice to put little statements out. Like I did here, saying, hey, the swamp terrain hexes, what's all this about? I'm going to do some research, a video's coming. This is that video, obviously. But I may use this in the future. I can submit posts from my phone on the YouTube app, so I don't know. This might be an interesting thing to use and leverage for folks who are curious what's going on. If I'm in a really busy mode with life and I can't do a video, I can at least check in and let folks know kind of what's going on, or stuff I'm looking at, or interesting things I want to share. So I may use this more in the future to kind of get you guys engaged or to keep you in the know. I can even do a poll. That's interesting. I can post images. I can link an existing YouTube video. So interesting feature. I'm going to try to use this more, I think, just to kind of help keep folks in the know about what's going on. Okay, so to the actual business here. So here's the thing. In this game, and in fact in many World War II games, the terrain type of swamp and the terrain type referred to as marsh or marshes are treated very usually the same. So when we say swamp, particularly in a European context, I think even for this game, the more appropriate term probably should have been marsh instead of swamp. Now, that's me saying this from a very American perspective, because when one thinks swamp in America, I can't help but think of Blast and CCR, down on the bayou, and you're thinking American South swamp kind of terrain. And that swamp, really dense wetlands, isn't always how a swamp or a marsh could exist. It could be a little bit different and less claustrophobic. So if you're imagining the Star Wars planet of Dagobah, when you think swamp, that's one kind of terrain that is like that. But I think in this game, it is referring more to marshes. But those two terms can be used interchangeably. And I say this because, when we look at that and say, okay, that's being listed as a swamp, that's a swamp. Well, they're also calling almost the entirety of the Netherlands a swamp. And they're calling the Pripyat marshes swamp. And I know them as the Pripyat marshes, right? That's how I'm going to refer to these, as the Pripyat marshes, Pripyat. I'm not sure the exact correct way to say that. that these are marshes, right? So in terms of the game, we're referring to them as swamps, but they're really more like marshes, right? That's the first thing I would point out. So that's the step one, right? Establishing and understanding this. The other thing is that one of the YouTube comments from someone said, go look at Google Maps pictures of these areas and you'll see they're not swamps or something to that effect. Well, here's the problem with that logic. Don't look at Google Maps for anything and expecting it to be exactly as it was 80 years ago in the 1940s, right? You're only going to see things from a satellite view in Google Maps, and if you look at like first-person view photos, those may not be looking at the areas that are marshes in these regions, right? So I don't want to be argumentative, but for the person who said go look on Google Maps, that's not a well thought out way to look at geography, particularly of historical areas, because those areas have changed over time. And we'll even talk a little bit about that later in the video, about like what they were doing even in the 30s to some of these terrain areas of Italy, where you can't expect that just because an area is dry today that it was dry 80 years ago or even older than that, right? Okay, so because I was bothered by the whole question and I wanted to do more research, right, I dug deeper. And by dug deeper, I mean I Googled some stuff, which anybody can do. So this is not, I am not a super research guy, but at least in the time that I could, I did some research. Okay, came across this website that's all about Sicily, apparently. If you just punch in like swamps near Sicily, or swamps near Syracuse, Sicily, you will find this website. It is not signed with HTTPS, so I probably shouldn't even be on this website. But it says here, the town of Syracuse, from the Greek word sirako, meaning swamp, occupies extremely beautiful position, blah, 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 blah. Okay, the word swamp shows up here once in this webpage. So the word Syracuse means swamp. Now, that's not indicative of much because it's just a name, but that is one important step in talking through this whole issue. So knowing that at one point in ancient times, when the Greeks were colonizing Syracuse, they named it after a swamp, or they named it after the word for swamp. So something to keep in mind. Additionally, I found this website, Best of Sicily magazine. Again, not secured. I'm probably getting all kinds of problems from this website from a security perspective, but not going to worry about that for the moment. So just there's this article that is talking about a region around Syracuse, located along Sicily's Ionian coast south of Syracuse, between Avola and Pacino. Vendicari is Europe's southernmost marshland, a protected reserve covering an extensive area. Blah, 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 there's some blah, blah, blah stuff, right? And then when they actually have the picture, this is going to be kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can... I'm not going to be able to get it any bigger. They have a highlighted area in red, which is right, that southeast tip of Syracuse. Or, I'm sorry, southeast tip of Sicily, where Syracuse is. So there is a marshland, a well-known marshland called Vendicari, right? Okay. Furthermore, I decided to reference my digital copy, though I have a physical copy, of Rich Atkinson's Liberation Trilogy. The second volume deals specifically with the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and there are some key markers that talk about the terrain of Sicily and Anzio that are relevant here. So you'll find on page 145, at least for the digital edition, I think it's 145 in my physical edition as well. I might have to double check that. There is a reference for soldiers that were afflicted with malaria in North Africa. They were coming into Sicily. There's a reference to the swampy Catania plain was particularly noxious. Where's the plain of Catania? What's the Catania plain? It is this region near Syracuse. right? This is the map that they're, this isn't very descriptive, obviously. But they're showing this region sort of around Syracuse, Catania. Catania Plain was swampy Catania Plain. Now, there's other references in here for, swampland. And here they're talking about, like, in Italy, some of the work that the Italian government was doing and the fascists were doing involved turning swampland into arable land because they were draining the swamps. So for that to be true, there had to have been swamps to begin with to actually drain, to turn it into arable land. And this is referenced later in the book as well, so I'm going to go to some more of those references. Maybe I didn't save it. There's another reference to marshes. So in the 1930s, they're draining these marshes and swampland for arable land. And at various points in this book, it is referencing the area of Anzio as being swampy. And this game is not the only game to portray the Anzio area as being a marsh or swampy. So this game, which is a map, this is the map for the game No Retreat Italian Front. I don't own this game. I've thought about getting it, and I just not committed to it really. But you can see they have the area around Venice set up with marsh swamp terrain. Their version of marsh swamp terrain, and then similarly near Anzio, you can see they have the swamp marshlands. And there is a difference when it comes to Syracuse, where in this game, Syracuse is not shown as swampy in this game. It's shown as clear or rough terrain, and so on. So where am I landing on all of this? I guess the thing about it is, when we look at Fall of the Third Reich, there's this question, swamps in Italy and Sicily, it's more likely than you think that there are marshlands. And again, I would prefer the term marsh than swamp in this context. I think the game should say, instead of it saying swamp here, it should say marsh. That would connect, I think, more with people and understanding what are we even talking about. Because a marsh doesn't have to be overgrown with a lot of trees and a lot of, tree cover and like you might be thinking if you're thinking about like an American swamp kind of thing. And if I again reference, the some of the historical points, the fact that there are still marshlands, like this is the most well-known southernmost marshland is around Syracuse. There are references to the swampland. There are references to that plain being particularly swampy. To me, that justifies, at least to some degree, why these hexes are listed as swamp marsh hexes. Now, I think where I would maybe have a greater, why I'm not 100% on board with it is just because, what is the meaning of making, all three of these hexes around Syracuse swamp? Maybe just the Syracuse hex should be swamp, right? I don't know. They made just this hex here swampy, swamp hex, and is representing the landings at Anzio. Maybe not all of Anzio, that area, is swamp. So every war game designer, when they're designing their map, kind of has to decide, for a given area that's delimited by a hex side, what terrain is it going to be? And if you only have one hex terrain type in a hex, you got to pick one or the other. Is there enough swamp that at effective combat operations, that in order to portray it in a game sense, you need to make the whole hex a swamp? I think that was the thinking here. There's enough swamp coverage, marshland coverage here, that it impacted combat operations enough that that those hexes should be swamp hexes. That's probably the thinking, right? Now, the Commonwealth in my game are having a really hard time getting into Syracuse. Part of it's because of the swamp hex. I think there's maybe a point to say, the swamp maybe didn't have that much of a impact on the amphibious invasion, but I think in the game terms of Fall of the Third Reich, an invasion is not just getting your guys onto the beach. It's more than that. It's actually getting them, inland, getting them inland, capturing the city, capturing the hex, which includes the surrounding area. And so in my failed invasions, you could interpret that as the Commonwealth, getting guys on the beach, but they couldn't hold any emplacements or any secure ground, and they had to retreat, they had to leave. And maybe that's where the marsh stuff comes in. They couldn't take the city, they couldn't take the surrounding areas. The plain of Catania just being too swampy to make progress against the entrenched defenders. However you want to interpret that, I think it, I guess I'm okay with it. Like, having done this 20 minutes of research, or half an hour or more of research as I was doing lookups in the book and trying to make references and see how much those make sense. I mean, and I do need to read this volume, The Day of Battle, the second volume in this trilogy. I'm still working my way through the first book, so I haven't read all the way through here. So there might be some additional insight that I will gain from reading the book and understanding how much swamp or marshlands really had an effect on the combat operations. But knowing what I've, knowing the knowledge that I have now in doing some slight research and comparing it to other war games that are trying to portray similar terrain, I think I'm okay with it. I'm okay with the Anzio one being marsh for sure. I think this one near Venice makes sense, though I would argue that the Venice hex should then also be marsh, but it's not for some reason, at least based on the way the map is designed. And I would, I'm fine either way with the Syracuse hex. If it weren't marsh, knowing what I know, I probably wouldn't care. The fact that it is a marsh, I understand more now, and I guess I'm okay with it. I looked at some other games, and for the most part, some World War II games at this scale only reserve marsh hexes for the Pripyat marshes, right? That the amount of marshland really mattered in Russia more than it mattered in Italy or some other areas. So I think it just comes down to whatever a war game designer is trying to achieve and how much they think that terrain had an impact at the scale of what is being represented here, right? We're dealing with core level units, where core level units affected by, maybe on an individual unit basis, lower than core, the swamps were a big issue, but maybe not for core level operations, right? That's the kind of thinking I guess you would need to have if you were trying to be as precise as possible here. But I'd still say, like I said, I think I'm okay with these hexes being swamp, for understanding what they really are, which are marshes. There are marshes around Syracuse. It is not a completely dry place. No matter what Google Maps says, it's a little more complicated than just assuming that the entire peninsula in Sicily is, rough, dry terrain. And I've only been to Rome and around Rome. I've not been all the way down here, so I am not an expert. But doing some cursory searches has unveiled that information. So that's all I really had to say, guys. I wanted to kind of talk through this because I kept thinking about it. I'm like, okay, well, if they're right and there are no swamps, then why the heck did swamps get included? How do I make sense of this? And I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I had to go look and I had to go find out what the deal was, and I have learned a thing or two, which is cool. Hopefully you've learned some stuff watching this, or if you already knew, then I hope this is good validation. Either way, so yeah, thanks for watching, guys. We'll do more Fall of the Third Reich as we get going, and we'll see you then. Take care. Keep on gaming.